Okay, well, welcome back, everyone. Thank you, thank you for staying here this afternoon for this second part of the program. I'm going to be talking about the circadian rhythm sleep disorders, and I'm very excited to be here today. I thank the organizers at the SRS Foundation for putting this program together, and I appreciate having been included. And I really appreciate that the circadian rhythm sleep disorders are part of the discussion, because for many years, it has been difficult, particularly at the FDA, to just even mention these disorders, and they're like, "What is that really? Is that really a sleep condition?" And before I discuss the disorders themselves, I'm going to talk about a little bit of the background of how the circadian rhythm system affects sleep. And so here. There is the master circadian pacemaker illustrated in the hypothalamus on either side of the third ventricle in a nucleus that has about 50,000 neurons on either side of the third ventricle in the anterior region of the hypothalamus. That's called the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus. And it drives a number of different physiologic functions, but notably the timing of the sleep propensity rhythm. And so here you can see individuals who we keep awake for 36 or 40 hours on a constant routine where they're in a constant semi-recumbent posture and given little snacks throughout day and night. Temperature of the room is kept the same in low levels of illumination. And what you can see under those conditions is that the circadian variation of body temperature, the release of the nocturnal hormone melatonin, involuntary slow-rolling eye movements, involuntary sleep episodes, they all have a prominent and robust circadian rhythms. This is performance, reaction time performance on the psychomotor vigilance task, and you can see that there is a circadian rhythm and that the average reaction time triples in the middle of the night and then starts getting better. Cognitive throughput as well as memory all vary with circadian phase. And what you'll notice here is that there is a paradoxical timing of these functions. So the least likely time in the circadian day for you to spontaneously and involuntarily fall asleep is at your bedtime. How crazy is that? So, so here's the habitual bedtime, this vertical dashed line here, and you can see that's the least time that someone is likely to spontaneously fall asleep in the laboratory when they're trying to be kept awake. And the time that you are most likely to have an involuntary transition from wakefulness to sleep, when this drive from the circadian system for sleep is the greatest, is paradoxically just before or at your habitual wake time. So when you're sitting pressing the snooze button in the morning and you wonder, why am I so tired? One of the reasons is that the circadian pacemaker is sending out the strongest drive for sleep, paradoxically, at that time. Now you might wonder, who designed this? We don't know that. But we can speculate as to why this might be. It does help to consolidate sleeping and waking, so the circadian system sends a stronger and stronger drive for waking as the day wears on, and that helps to give us a second wind. Now, you may be thinking, well, I didn't really have a second wind, now I got a cup of coffee, and that's what's keeping me going. But in fact, the second wind kicks in much later in the day, in the evening. Ironically, just around the time that you're deciding whether or not to go to bed, suddenly you have this surge of energy at that time. And that usually occurs in most day-active species just before dusk. It may have had some evolutionary advantage because you don't want to be taking a nap if you're day active and you can't see anything in the dark and wake up and it's dark. So there's this, you're least likely to be asleep within the whole circadian day just before what would be dusk in your local time zone. Now, because of artificial light, we have shifted that timing of dusk to be much later, and we've therefore shifted the timing of this surge. And if this surge becomes misaligned so that it's now occurring right in the middle of when you're trying to go to bed, that is, I would argue, what propels the entire sleep pharmaceutical industry, because when you try to go to sleep in the middle of this waking surge, you're going to have a lot of difficulty falling asleep. And these are the slow rolling eye movements that are being charted here, and you can see they peak just before habitual wake time, and they decline. We've known for many years that the timing and organization of sleep, spontaneous sleep, if you're living in an environment where you don't know what time it is, no clocks, radios, information sources as to the time of day, and you're there for a month or two, then the spontaneous duration of your sleep will vary very robustly with what time of day it is in your body. In fact, even if you fractionate sleep and give people only 1 hour to sleep out of every 3, and I don't recommend that you try this at home, although a lot of undergraduates are trying this. It's called the polyphasic sleep system, and they come to college and they say, you know, I'm ready for college because I'm dividing my sleep up into 8 hourly episodes so that I don't get too much sleep at a time. It's one of the biggest fads on college campuses right now, which is crazy because we've known for 50 years that if you do that, you only get 4 hours. You spend 8 hours in bed and you only get 4 hours of sleep because there are some phases of the circadian day when you can't sleep. So you're in bed for an hour here in the wake maintenance zone in the evening, right before your habitual bedtime. You only get 10 minutes out of sleep out of every hour in that circumstance. Whereas your peak sleep efficiency occurs when you go to sleep near the nadir of your body temperature cycle, which is just before your habitual wake time, around 9 o'clock in the morning here. Not only does the amount of sleep that you get vary with circadian phase, but the internal organization of sleep varies. So the percentage of sleep, the percentage of the time that you're in REM sleep varies with circadian phase and peaks very near our, and peaks, the peak timing of REM sleep is in the latter half of the night, very near our habitual wake time. In fact, that's why shift workers, when they work all night, and then they go to sleep in the morning after having worked, are likely to fall directly into rapid eye movement sleep. That's the peak of the REM propensity rhythm, and these black bars indicate when REM onsets are happening, which otherwise is diagnostic of narcolepsy. In fact, when we were doing these studies 40 years ago, you know, the question was, were all these normal volunteers narcoleptic because they were all having REM onsets if they went to sleep at that particular phase, and at that time it was considered diagnostic of narcolepsy. But that reflects the tremendous impact of the circadian system on the timing and organization of sleep. And so this second wind under ordinary circumstances is happening just before our habitual bedtime. And then the peak drive for sleep, as I mentioned, is occurring, and when we're most likely to be able to fall asleep quickly is near our habitual wake time. We release the hormone melatonin, and thankfully, when that hormone is released, it gloms onto melatonin receptors that cover the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the cells of the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus. And when the melatonin gloms onto those melatonin receptors, it quiets the output of the SCN. So instead of continuing to send that strong waking drive that would be occurring in the late evening, that quiets the output and stops this waking drive emanating from the circadian pacemaker, so that once melatonin is released here, sleep efficiency, which has been, the healthy volunteers have been awake for 30% of the time when they try to sleep during this wake maintenance zone. And as soon as the melatonin is released, they have 97% sleep efficiency. So suddenly they go from being awake 30% of the time to being awake 3% of the time. And people my age, this is young volunteers, people my age when they try to sleep at an adverse circadian phase are awake 50 to 60% of the time. But then that again improves to over 90% sleep efficiency as soon as the endogenous melatonin is released. So the brain depends on the release of this hormone, which it controls the timing of, in order to allow us to greatly increase our sleep efficiency and be able to go to sleep right after the end of that strong wake-promoting drive emanating from the circadian pacemaker. So now you can see how misalignment of this system can lead to insomnia. Because if this second wind slips into the later time, then it's going to interfere with the ability to sleep between the habitual bedtime and the habitual wake time. So what controls what we would call the phase angle of the circadian system. Now the phase angle, I hate to use a technical term like that because it sort of turns people off. As soon as you say something like that, they're like, check out, I don't know what he's talking about. But what I'm talking about is, in terms of the phase angle, is very important because it determines when this strong drive for waking is going to happen. If it happens after your bedtime, you're going to have trouble falling asleep. If it happens when you're having dinner, you're going to have trouble staying awake because you're going to be releasing melatonin many hours before your usual bedtime. So what determines the exact timing in an individual? I'm giving you the average timing here, but I'm not discussing inter-individual differences, but I'm going to in a moment. Okay, sorry about that. So what determines inter-individual differences are a couple of things. One can be your inter-individual differences in your sensitivity to resetting of the circadian system by light. But I'm going to set that aside for a moment, and I'm going to talk about inter-individual differences in the period of the circadian pacemaker that drives our circadian rhythms. So how do we measure the period of that system? We put people in candlelight for a month, and we schedule the timing of their sleeping and waking to be outside the range of synchronization of the circadian system. There are a range of day lengths to which the circadian system can entrain, and it can't entrain to a 20-hour day or a 28-hour day or an 11-hour day. That's way outside of the range of capture of the circadian system, particularly when you're living in candlelight. So we schedule the sleep times to a non-physiologic range in terms of the circadian system. So here is somebody, every day we're scheduling to go to bed 4 hours later, which is the equivalent of traveling 4 hours westward across time zones. When we do that, now we can follow some circadian marker. In this case, it's melatonin. This is the timing of the duration of melatonin secretion. And you can see that even though the person is living on a 28-hour day, and by the way, Nathaniel Kleitman is the first one to have used this protocol in 1938 in Mammoth Cave in Kentucky. So I like to call it the Kleitman protocol. And when they're on that protocol, he first noticed that the timing of the body temperature cycle continues to oscillate with a near 24-hour period under those conditions. Here we're following melatonin, and you can see that it is oscillating with a near 24-hour period in this individual. The time of day is across the horizontal axis, and the day of the experiment is across the vertical axis. So this is midnight, and you see that the timing of the release of melatonin is if you look at the midpoint, is very close to 24 hours, whereas the day is going 4 hours westward each day. Now, I'm going to ask you to look at one other thing. You see here, these black areas are when the person is awake during a scheduled sleep episode. And so you can see that here, they're asleep during the scheduled sleep episode, no wakefulness at the beginning. But then when they're trying to sleep out of phase, when they're not releasing this magic hormone melatonin, there's a lot of wakefulness, particularly in the latter half of the night, that is disturbing their sleep, okay? And, and that is a reflection of the fact that they're trying to sleep at a time that they're not releasing melatonin. And here, when they're sleeping in phase, they're able to sleep more soundly. Here, this chart is illustrating the fact that some have a period, that some are beginning to release melatonin every day earlier and earlier under this condition because they have an internal clock that has a shorter than 24-hour period. But on average, 3/4 of the people have a period that's longer than 24 hours. The people with a shorter than 24-hour period tend to be women, and the people with a longer than 24-hour period tend to be men. So 3 times as many women than men have a shorter than 24-hour period. So their internal clock runs a little bit faster than men. It's only about a 6-minute difference on average, but it can be a big difference for an individual because the range is up to about 3/4 to a full hour, the range of different periods that people might have as their internal clock period. So now, if you have a 23.7-hour period, then every day you have to reset your circadian system to be by 0.3 of an hour later. But if you don't do anything, if you're in the dark in a conference room, whatever, it's constantly going to be going earlier. The person with a 24.5-hour period, every day the tendency is going to go to be later, and you're constantly having to drag it back in order to remain synchronized to the 24-hour day. Well, that adds up over time. So here's the distribution of periods that I was telling you about. It goes from about 23.7 or 8 all the way up to 24.5 in healthy sighted individuals. And this is that mysterious thing that I called phase angle. And so if this is your regular bedtime, and this is a really weird graph, so bear with me, this is the period of your circadian system as marked here. So some people, like I said, have a shorter than 24-hour period. Some people have a longer than 24-hour period. And I'm sorry, the one thing that most people know about circadian rhythms is that people have a 25-hour period. That's wrong. I mean, that's what it was thought to be in the 1970s. I won't go into the technical reasons why those experiments were wrong, except to say that people had access to electric light. They thought that light had no effect on humans at that time. And so they didn't realize that every day they were resetting their circadian rhythms is why it looked like they had a 25-hour period. I'm sorry, for those of you who are wondering why am I talking about such a close to 24-hour period. Okay, so here's the regular bedtime. This is the intrinsic period of the oscillator, what it would do if you were living in candlelight. And then this is the phase angle of people living in society. So they don't know that they have a 24.5-hour period or a 24.5-hour period. The people with the 23.6-hour period, they are releasing the sleep-promoting hormone melatonin nearly 5 hours before bedtime. So if they're going to bed at 10, they're releasing this hormone, this natural hypnotic, at 5 p.m. when they're having dinner. If they have, on the other hand, a longer period, then they're not releasing it till right before they go to bed. So needless to say, this person is not the life of the party, because they got this, their blood is being bathed in this sleep-promoting hormone as they're trying to get together with their friends, this, that, and the other. And some of us have a mixed marriage where one person is an extreme morning person because they got the clock going in the early direction, and the other spouse is an extreme late person because they got the clock going in the other direction. It can be good if you have kids because you can cover more of the 24 hours. Yeah, it is challenging. So, so that's the nature of how this system works. And given that the phase of the circadian system regulates the consolidation of sleep and our ability to maintain consolidated sleep, and you only release this hormone for about 10 hours a day. So, if 5 of those hours are before you even get in bed, it's not going to help you maintain sleep for 8 hours. So you're going to run out of the hormone after 5 hours in bed. And now, the rest of the time, so those are the people who are going to be like up early, like, okay, why isn't everybody else up at 5 in the morning? Whereas the people who don't even release it until they're going to bed, and it's going to be released for 10 hours now, or even after they're going to bed, they're like exhausted when they get up in the morning. But they're the life of the party in the evening. They don't want to go to bed in the evening. Okay. So the neuroanatomy of photoentrainment this is just a cartoon illustration. So there's this complicated multisynaptic pathway that leads from specialized photoreceptors in the eye and leads up to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which then in turn innervates through a multisynaptic pathway, the pineal. And if you're in constant darkness or blind, totally blind, without eyes, for example, then the circadian system, if you have a longer than 24-hour period, will keep oscillating with the 24-hour period. So many people think if you're totally blind, don't have eyes, that your circadian system is not oscillating. That's not true. It's just not synchronized with the 24-hour day in all likelihood. I mean, there's a big asterisk there. I guess it's more complicated than that because there are non-photic synchronizers, but I'm not going to get into that right now. So a couple hundred years ago, before the advent of artificial light, of course, we're not there to measure this, but this is a phase response curve to light. So light exposure in what we call the delay region of the system, that is to say, in the afternoon and evening, light exposure here resets the circadian system to a later hour. So for the people who have a shorter than 24-hour period, that's when they need to get light exposure to keep the circadian system entrained or synchronized to the 24-hour day. For people who have a longer than 24-hour period, they need to get light exposure in the morning. But the fact is that every moment that we're exposed to light, this light that's shining right in my face as I'm standing here, is resetting my circadian system. So it is not as if, because we're getting reset over here, it's not as if because we're getting reset over here that we're not also being reset over here. So it's the balance of our total daily light exposure that keeps us synchronized to the 24-hour day. Now, if we have enough light exposure during the day, all of us, no matter what our period is, and Ken Wright did these beautiful studies when he was in Boston, if you increase the strength of the synchronizer, then we're all bunched together. That 5-hour disbursement that I just showed you, that shrinks down to, what was it, Ken, about 45 minutes. Everybody is scrunched up together. There's still a relationship with period, but we're all scrunched up together. But we get dispersed when one person's turning on the lights. So the night owl is keeping the lights on late, the early bird is getting more exposure to light in the morning. That disperses us. That puts us further apart. So back then, the second wind was probably in the afternoon when everybody's getting a Starbucks. And so they didn't need a Starbucks at that time. But now with the advent of artificial light, we have shifted the whole system later and squeezed the time available for sleep because we're all in a perpetual summertime instead of having the usual seasonal variation. But nonetheless, our exposure to the light-dark cycle is all that keeps the system synchronized or entrained to the 24-hour day. So that's how photo entrainment works. Now, the reason why I spent some time on this is because there's no way of understanding any of the circadian rhythm sleep disorders without understanding how this system works. It's important to understand that even very small amounts of light exposure, like 10, 12 minutes, even 1 minute of light exposure, can have a resetting effect on the circadian system. And so this is the amount of light exposure duration and how it varies with circadian, these are duration response functions. Also, the wavelength of light is critical. And everybody's heard all sorts of stuff about how blue light is most effective at resetting our circadian systems. And that's basically because we have intrinsically photosensitive ganglion cells in the retina, and those intrinsically photosensitive ganglion cells have a specialized photopigment called melanopsin, which we inherited from marine organisms. And those marine organisms, the principal wavelength of light that they're exposed to in the blue ocean is 480 nanometers. That is the wavelength that gets down through the sea. And that is the wavelength to which we are most sensitive for resetting our circadian system. Unfortunately, the blue LED, which enables all of the LED lighting, because when I was in college, we did have red LEDs and green ones that were used to tell if the stereo was on or not. But nobody could make white light out of those highly energy efficient engineering feats because nobody had a blue LED, and you need all three to make white light. And that's why a few years ago, a scientist got a Nobel Prize for having figured out how to do the blue LED, and that has led to the complete revolution. Why in 2014, incandescent lamps were banned in the United States and so on, because it's much more energy efficient. That's great. But the primary driver of that light that's coming to you is 460 nanometers. And that's why it's about 2 to 3 times more impact, if not more, on the circadian system. But it's complicated, like everything else. So for shorter durations and lower intensity, The green channel is actually more effective, so around 555 nanometers, the rods and cones, which synapse onto those same intrinsically photosensitive ganglion cells. So at the beginning, because the melanopsin system is very sluggish, takes a long time to activate, and it continues to be effective even during very long exposures when the rods and cones have bleached out. But the much more responsive system is still the rods and cones. So the green light is more effective for lower irradiances and for shorter intensities. But for long intensities, like 5-6 hours intensity, the shorter wavelength of light is going to be twice as effective at resetting the circadian system than the longer wavelength of light. And that's why, if you're exposed to light from an iPad or some other light-emitting e-reader or screen or computer or laptop or whatever, and if you're reading from that in the evening and you don't have your blue blocking glasses on, or you don't have some other technology that's removing the blue light from the screen, then you're going to suppress your melatonin and shift your circadian system by about an hour and a half. You'll be more tired when you wake up. You'll have less REM sleep because you've pushed the REM sleep off of the edge of your, and this is even if you shut the lights out at 10 and have complete darkness from 10 to 6. If you don't shut the lights out at 10, if you decide when to shut the lights out, and you have, and you're reading from a light-emitting ebook instead of a printed book, then you're going to decide about 45 minutes later to shut the lights out, because you'll be more alert, you'll be less tired, and you'll be less likely to make the decision to go to sleep. So with that context, let's talk about the circadian rhythm sleep disorders. So there are, which are now, thanks to Phyllis, called circadian rhythm sleep-wake disorders, because it's not just sleep that's affected, but also wakefulness. Thank you, Phyllis. And they consist of these 6 disorders, which I'm going to go through briefly. Before I do, I want to mention that there are only 3 FDA-approved treatments for any of these 6 disorders. One is modafinil for shift work disorder, armodafinil for shift work sleep-wake disorder as well, and then tasimelteon for non-24-hour sleep-wake disorder. By way of disclosure, I was a consultant on all 3 of these for both Cephalon and Vanda Pharmaceuticals. So shift work disorder. So shift work disorder, as the name implies, relates to people who are chronically exposed to working a fraction of the 24-hour day that overlaps with the time that they usually sleep. It used to refer simply to people who work the overnight shift, but more and more people are now working shifts that start between 3 and 6 a.m. In fact, that's the largest growing sector of the working day, because so many people, 6 a.m. flights, you got to have airport screeners there at 3 o'clock in the morning, and so a lot of people are having very early morning shifts, and so now we have people with shift work disorder who actually have shifts that are starting very early. And now the ASM criteria specifically include that early morning shifts can be part of the condition. So now, if you want to look at what impact shift work has on the ability to maintain consolidated sleep, I put together these 2 diagrams. So this is the impact on sleep, and in order for us to maintain consolidated sleep, this is a really weird 3-dimensional diagram. So we got time of day here on the horizontal axis, then we got how long you're in the sleep episode on the y-axis, and then on the z-axis, what percentage of the time that you're awake, okay? So normally, the way we maintain consolidated sleep is we go to bed right after the wake maintenance zone at 10 o'clock in the evening, and we're able to go to sleep then because we just released the hormone melatonin. And then we sleep, we have to proceed along a diagonal because time of day and length of time in the sleep episode are varying simultaneously. We proceed along the diagonal, and we wake up right after the peak drive for sleep emanating from the circadian system. Okay, so that's the channel that we have to go down in order to maintain consolidated sleep. If we go to bed like the shift worker at 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning, we're going to have to climb this mountain of wakefulness in the latter half of the sleep episode. Now, on the other hand, if you're trying to stay awake during the night, then if you start out your shift here at midnight, then you're going to get into this critical zone of vulnerability where the probability of your eyes rolling around in their sockets is going to be very high because of the strong circadian drive for sleep that is occurring at that particular phase. So these are the challenges that the shift worker faces. And that's why the two complaints are either insomnia during the daytime sleep or excessive sleepiness during night work. And those are the two principal features. And just to show you how impactful this can be, this is a study that we did, published a couple of years ago, in which we looked at shift workers on a simulated drive on an actual track in a real car right after they worked the night shift or right after they slept. So they're trying to drive very near the time when the strongest drive for sleep is emanating from the circadian pacemaker, which is on their way home from work. And you see that 1/3 of the night shift workers, the Liberty Mutual employee who was it was like a special car, like a driver's ed car, on an instrumented track, and they had EEG machines on, and they had two of us in the back and this driver in the front. So they're being monitored, they're being watched, they know they're part of a study, and yet 1/3 of the time, the Liberty Mutual employee, who was, by the way, insuring the study, had to slam on the brakes because the person's going off the side of the road. And having been in the back of the car when that happened, it's really scary because this track was not designed to have special area. So I was praying that that the Liberty Mutual person was going to be awake and ready to slam on the brakes when the person drifted off of the side of the road. And which usually happened after about 45 minutes of driving. Even though, by the way, we stopped every 15 minutes for a short break, but still. And they deteriorated from the first minute that they were driving. They had much larger standard deviation of the lane position and all the other usual metrics. So what can be done? The first registration trial for any circadian rhythm sleep-wake disorder was published about 13 years ago, and we showed that the number of lapses was cut in half when they were on modafinil as compared to when they were on placebo. And if you looked at the effect over the time of the night, even though they had many fewer incidents driving home when they were on modafinil as compared to placebo, still the effect was wearing off as the night wore on, which is why Cephalon then went to an enantiomer that has a longer half-life, armodafinil, and there you could see that the effect was maintained throughout the night instead of being being much less effective after the middle of the night. So now, chronic sleep deficiency is associated with many adverse consequences, including increased risk of cancer, fatal and non-fatal coronary heart disease, gastrointestinal disorders, mental health disorders, obesity and diabetes, and so on. In fact, we've shown in the laboratory that even if we bring people in for 2.5 weeks and expose them to exactly what happens to shift workers, recurrent circadian disruption along with sleep deficiency, because shift workers lose a couple of hours per 24 hours when they're working the night shift, then within 2.5 weeks, they started having increased glucose levels when they were exposed. And by the way, we realigned them. So it was a history of recurrent circadian disruption, but we had realigned the circadian system at the time that we did the assessment. But just that prior history, they had actually decreased insulin levels in the face of higher glucose levels, which puts them in a pre-diabetic state. Fortunately, after about 10 days back on a regular schedule, they did fully recover. Now, what happens if you're doing this for years could be a different story. So speaking of something that is usually viewed as transient, jet lag disorder is the next circadian rhythm sleep disorder, and I would commend those of you who are interested in this to read this recent article by Josephine Arendt review article on approaches to the pharmacological management of jet lag disorder. But the ICSD criteria of jet lag disorder is that it, again, can be either insomnia or excessive daytime sleepiness, insomnia at night in the new time zone, or EDS in the new time zone, accompanied by lower sleep time and associated with travel across at least 2 time zones. So some of you may have experienced that, in fact, coming to this meeting. And, and as she points out, there's poor sleep, daytime sleepiness, and mistimed physiologic functions. So a number of treatment efforts have been made to address this. You can see in this case, somebody just coming from Tokyo to Boston, their circadian rhythms are inverted, body temperature reaching a nadir in the middle of the afternoon. Light treatment can reset the circadian system and get it completely realigned. There have been a variety of treatments tried. This is the largest treatment of melatonin that was tried, which was not successful. But interestingly enough, they found in this study that 2/3 of the travelers had moderate to severe jet lag, and about 1/3 of them had minimal symptoms of jet lag. They tried various doses of melatonin without impact. Interestingly, in terms of everybody thinks about jet lag, oh, well, in a few days you'll get over it. But in fact, there can be some adverse consequences that you will not get over. So injuries turn out to be, and I only really realized this when I was going on a trip to Asia and went to the travel clinic at our hospital because I was worried about infections, like most people are. And the doctor said, your biggest risk is actually road crashes. And I said, what? Because of course I'm, drowsy driving. I'm, very interested in that topic. And it turns out that that the injuries are the leading cause of death among travelers, and the travelers are 10 times more likely to die from injury than infection, which accounts for less than 2% of traveler deaths. And road traffic crashes account for 57% of all traveler deaths. And yet, the field has not really thought that much about this issue. Although the courts have, and in fact, they've dealt with, this is just a couple of cases. This was a case from some years ago of this man who killed his wife, grandson, and cousin. This person who killed a random stranger falling asleep at the wheel. This was just he was just sentenced in September of just last month. So these are happening. And I think it's something that we have to think about, because so many travelers will fly to Europe, and then at the equivalent of 3 o'clock in the morning, US time, they'll get into a car to go from their destination and drive over the Alps or do whatever. And a lot of business travelers do that because they get into one destination and they need to drive to another. Also, chronic jet lag can produce, there was this paper that was published in Nature Neuroscience a number of years ago showing actually atrophy of the temporal lobe in individuals over a 5-year period who recurrently cross time zones. And this is associated with memory loss and so on. And they hypothesize that higher levels of cortisol secretion are responsible. There have been a series of papers out of Heathrow Airport because the psychiatric facility near Heathrow gets most of their referrals from patients who are at Heathrow, and they show that crossing time zones for in an eastward direction is more likely to be associated with manic episodes, and going westward is more likely to be associated with the increased risk of depression. Even if you're not traveling, and you have a different bedtime and wake time on free days as compared to your work days, the greater the amount of social jet lag that you recurrently experience, the higher your risk of obesity and being overweight. Delayed sleep phase disorder is one of the most common circadian rhythm disorders, and it is affecting somewhere between 0.5% to 8% of the population. It affects up to 1 out of 4 people who identify themselves as evening types. And it is characterized by sleep and wake onsets that are intractably later than desired, actual sleep times that are nearly at the same time every day, and people with delayed sleep wake phase disorder can actually do fine when they are not required to get up at a specific hour. By the way, it's been known for more than a century, describing people who lie awake for hours after going to bed but don't actually fall asleep until toward morning. It can be quite, and I'm sorry for the busyness of this slide, but it can be have quite an adverse impact on work performance and school performance. So people with delayed sleep phase disorder have twice the risk of missing school or work days, more than 4 days in a week, having reduced productivity. They're at 4 times the risk, age 31 to 65, of having reduced productivity at least 4 days a week, disrupted work and social life, disrupted family life, 2 to 3 times the risk on all of these factors. So it can have big impact using the Sheehan disability scale on many different aspects of the person's life. Now, this is one of the coolest parts of what I'm going to talk about today, because it turns out that half the people, and now there have been 3 different studies that have shown this, half the people diagnosed with delayed sleep-wake phase disorder do not have a delayed circadian phase. Shadal Brayman discovered this working with Colin Shapiro in Toronto. I'm going to say this again. Half the people, and this came as a complete shock to everyone in the field, half the people diagnosed with delayed sleep-wake phase disorder do not have a delayed circadian phase. So everybody thought, okay, if somebody's coming into the office and complaining they don't go to fall asleep till 4 o'clock in the morning and they don't wake up till noon, the sleep field said, I'll just keep a diary for a couple of weeks, and if that's the consistent pattern, they have delayed sleep phase disorder, and you should aim all of your treatments at shifting their circadian phase to an earlier hour. So Shadab said, gee, I wonder if they do have a delayed circadian phase. He measured melatonin onset, and half of them have a completely normal onset of 8:30 in the evening. 8:30 in the evening. So treatments aimed at shifting that to an earlier hour are not going to be effective. So a couple of years ago, Phyllis and I were at an APSS meeting, and we were talking about this, and one of the sleep clinicians got up and said, yes, but they do have a delayed sleep phase, which is true. But the treatment targets have to be different in someone who has a delayed circadian phase. The treatments are targeted at shifting the phase earlier, versus someone who does not have a delayed circadian phase. They may have sleep onset insomnia. They may have a variability in the rate at which they build up homeostatic drive for sleep. There could be a number of different reasons, and a lot of research needs to go into the pathophysiology of delayed sleep-wake phase disorder without a delayed circadian phase. But we're proposing now that there be 2 different subtypes of delayed sleep-wake phase disorder, one being delayed circadian phase type, DCPT, and the other being delayed sleep-wake type, DSWT. Because the treatment approaches have to be different for these 2 conditions, and it's going to affect pharmacologic trials, because if you don't type them before you do the trial, you can have all sorts of people. You may have the greatest drug for resetting circadian rhythms, but if you give it to people who don't have an issue with their circadian rhythms, just on the basis of a sleep-wake diary, then you're not going to be able to diagnose them correctly. And this is the kind of diagnostic test that you could do. This is an individual who can't fall asleep 3-4 hours, classic. Sleeps fine when he's on vacation. Then if we bring him into the lab, he doesn't know what time it is. We shift his sleep to an earlier hour. He can't fall asleep. He sleeps 15% of the time here. Doesn't know what time it is. We do it again the second night. He sleeps 30% of the time here. Can't sleep at this phase. And then we put him back here. And so we've demonstrated that he has both a delayed circadian phase, which we at that time could monitor with body temperature, as well as a delayed timing of a sleep-wake cycle. So what could be going on? For the people with the delayed circadian phase type, they could have excessive exposure to evening light. They could have an increased sensitivity to evening light. they could have a decreased resetting capacity to shift them earlier, or they could have a long intrinsic period, as I told you about before. The most common, probably the long circadian period is a minority of cases. Probably most people these days have either excessive exposure to evening light or an increased phase delay shifting capacity. Now, those who don't, the delayed sleep-wake type, they could have a decreased rate of rise of the homeostatic sleep drive. It's one of the things that happens. It's an extraordinary thing that happens. From age 7 to age 17, we lose 100 trillion synapses in the brain. I'm going to say that again because it's surprising to me. We prune 100 trillion synapses during development between age 7 and 17. And as we prune those synapses, the rate at which homeostatic drive builds up declines dramatically. And that's why teenagers are able to stay up later. That's why they get exposure to light later. Their period may also change. But that's responsible for the tremendous delay that happens during adolescence and why school start times should be delayed as well. So we could have a situation where the rate of increasing sleepiness associated with homeostatic drive becomes either shallower, or in some people it may be less shallow. So that rate may affect whether or not you're susceptible to this condition. So to summarize, artificial light, the wake maintenance zone is here in the absence of artificial light, so that's in the afternoon. We have moved it to the evening, but because of all the light exposure that we're getting, and we're getting 10 times as much per capita light exposure as we had when I was growing up, and I already showed you this, then the people with delayed sleep-wake phase disorder, they may be peaking with the circadian system late in the day after midnight, and that may be why they can't go to bed till 3 o'clock in the morning. And recently, presented at the SRBR meeting in 2018, earlier this May, I was very excited about this because the hypothesis that we made in 1981 that they might have a greater sensitivity to resetting by light in the evening was presented in this abstract, where they had almost twice the resetting response in response to evening light, those who had delayed sleep-wake phase disorder, as compared to the control group. And these are the data that I've already reviewed with you, that women have a shorter period than men, and that's related to this, now that we have a larger sample, 8-hour range of phase angle of entrainment between different individuals. And this past year, Mike Young and colleagues, and Mike is the one who won the Nobel Prize that year for his work on circadian rhythms, have found that a mutation of the CRY1 gene is responsible for a cohort of patients with familial delayed sleep phase disorder. So there can also be a genetic basis to this. Now, advanced sleep phase disorder is very much like delayed sleep phase disorder, except number one, it's much less common, except among older people, where it is more common, but probably does not have the same circadian basis. In fact, we're quite certain it doesn't have the same circadian basis, because the period of the circadian system does not change with age. And the phase angle position is mostly a response, we believe, to shifting of the circadian system by earlier morning light exposure. But there are a subset of individuals who have a markedly advanced phase of their circadian system, which you can't see when they're living on a regular schedule of sleeping at night and awake during the day, and we've been able to view that on a constant routine, and you can see that this individual had a 23.7-hour period of the circadian system. These are individuals with familial advanced sleep phase, or sleep-wake phase disorder, as we would call it today, and this is someone with a 23.3-hour period, and this missense mutation results in a shorter circadian period, and these people have a phenotype, these affected family members, where they're going to sleep at 7 o'clock in the evening and waking up at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. Now, non-24-hour sleep-wake rhythm disorder was first described in a totally blind person who was unable to synchronize to the 24-hour day. And this index case, which was published in Science in 1977 by Lawton Miles and colleagues at Stanford, this individual had a nearly 25-hour period, going to sleep at a later time each day. They tried to constrain his sleep. He was still sleeping on the same schedule. They tried to strictly constrain his sleep, and then he quit after, he said, I can't function here. And this was a great index case. It kind of put non-24-hour disorder on the map. The only problem with this case is that 96% of blind patients don't exhibit this pattern, which would not be a problem except for the fact that we wrote the nosology right after this case was published. And so the nosology says, and it has not really been modified, they change the name every 5 years, but it hasn't really changed the structure since 1979 when this was written. So the nosology says, expect blind people to come in and just collect their logs for a couple of weeks and see that their sleep times are getting later and later each day. But 96% of blind people with this condition have sleep times that look like this, that are at the same time every day. They're doing what everybody does when we fly to a different country. Like you fly to China, you fly to France, you fly to Russia. You don't try to sleep during the day, during the time in your old time zone. You try to sleep at night in Moscow or at night in Tokyo. And you have insomnia when you try to sleep at night. And that's exactly what most blind people do, is they try to sleep at night. They have things that they're doing during the daytime. They have jobs, they have families, they have whatever's happening. So even though right after this was published in 1979, Orth and colleagues at Vanderbilt published a study saying, wait a minute, our person is living on a 24-hour schedule, but their circadian rhythms are not synchronized to the 24-hour day. But nobody really paid attention to all these other studies because this was already written into the nosology at that point. So circadian entrainment failure should be the principal diagnostic criteria. And I must say that as a consultant of Anna, my interactions with the FDA on this topic drove me completely up the wall because the FDA's response was, that's just a biomarker, that's not the real condition. It's the timing of their sleep that's the real condition. And I'm like, you're making me crazy here, because it's the loss of entrainment. That is non-24-hour disorder, circadian entrainment failure. And here's an example of somebody regularly scheduled bedtime and wake time, severe insomnia, loss of 3 to 4 hours of sleep at night, that recurs only infrequently. So here's this particular person fortunately kept a diary in Braille for 15 years, and a postdoc in the lab was kind enough to learn Braille so that he could translate the diary. He translated it for the 15 years, and you can see that the amount of sleep at night varied tremendously. And the nap time, when he couldn't sleep at night, he was a high school teacher, he would take a nap in the afternoon. I asked him when he went to bed and when he woke up. He told me he went to bed at 10, woke up at 6. I said, what about on weekends? And he said, what didn't you understand about my answer? I go to bed at 10 and I get up at 6. German school teacher, that was it. But there were some days where he could only sleep 3, 4 hours, 5 hours, and it occurred with a regular pattern. In fact, these peaks are exactly 100 days apart. And so what we realized, 100 days apart, going on for 15 years, what could be going on there? I didn't even plot it this way. Professor Richard Cronauer, a mathematician who's in his 90s now, we're actually writing a paper together. So he's still going strong. But Richard said, you got to plot it in this particular way. You got to look at this pattern, and it looks like one oscillator is not synchronized with the 24-hour day. And he said, Chuck, if it's slipping by 15 minutes a day, how many days is it going to take to go completely around the clock? And I said, let's see. I got to take off my shoes. 15. I said, well, I guess about 96 days. And he said, correct. And he said, that's why he has an approximately 100-day cycle. He said, bring him into the lab and see if he has a 100-day cycle, as I predicted. So I thought, well, he's not going to come into it. But he did. He came into the lab for 100 days. And lo and behold, his body temperature, cortisol, everything oscillated, even though we kept him exactly in bed only at night between 10 and 6 German time. he nonetheless, all of his circadian rhythms, cortisol, REM sleep, everything oscillated with a 24.27 hour period, which was pretty close to what Cronauer predicted from the just from his sleep-wake times. So of course, nothing is that simple. So, like a year later, somebody comes into the lab, and I'm trying to find out his cyclic, how often he's having this cyclic sleep problem. And I'm looking at him, and 3 hours later of what he considered an interrogation, he's like, I don't have any sleep problems. And so I finally came to accept that. I'm looking at his crystal clear blue eyes. He had nystagmus as we're talking, and suddenly it occurred to me, I wonder if somehow light is resetting his circadian system, even though he's unaware of it and he's totally blind. So he brought him into the lab, and lo and behold, we could suppress melatonin with light that he couldn't see. His circadian rhythms were completely synchronized to the 24-hour day. The New England Journal made us bring him in again and do the whole thing while he was blindfolded. He said, I don't get this. I'm totally blind. Why are you blindfolding me? And I said, it's hard to explain. But anyway, we showed that with his eyes covered, he did not suppress melatonin because it was going through, the light was reaching his circadian system through his eyes. And that led to the discovery of these intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells that I told you about earlier. Interestingly, it turns out that, and this is the work of Joe Hull and colleagues, of those totally blind participants with intact eyes, we now know that half exhibit melatonin suppression. So the totally blind people with phthitic eyes, the shrunken eyes that you sometimes see, or with their eyes removed, which was done for cosmetic reasons for many people, those are the people who are more likely to suffer from non-24-hour disorder. Here's the beautiful work of John Emmons and colleagues at the University of Oregon, showing by having people come back this is 390 days, so it's more than a year, and he has them come back every 2 weeks, and it takes blood samples every hour for melatonin to assess the phase of their circadian system. And you can see that this individual, who has a beat cycle length of 133 days, has a period of 24.2 hours approximately. This individual who has a beat cycle of 72 days, that means that he has a period, or she, of 24 1/3 hours. This person who has a beat cycle of 25 or so days means that they're moving about an hour a day. So you can actually tell their intrinsic period from how long it takes for their circadian systems to wind around and round the clock. It meant that when, after having finally convinced Founded Pharmaceuticals to evaluate their circadian regulator as a potential treatment for non-24-hour disorder, I must say that the executives there were in a complete state of shock when I told them that each study would have to be so long in order to find out if the individuals were entrained. And it actually took them almost 10 years to make the decision to actually evaluate their compound as a regulator in this condition because of the difficulties of doing the studies. But you can do the studies. This is what, if you're using urinary melatonin secretion as they did, as a marker, this would be week 1, week 2, week 3, and week 4 in someone who is normally entrained, and in someone who is non-entrained, week 1, week 2, week 3, and week 4, you see how chaotic. Every time you bring them in, they have a different phase. In this case, the beat cycle was 34 days. The shorter the period is, closer to 24 hours, the longer is the beat cycle. It turns out it does also affect sighted people. We published this paper in 1978 of a sighted individual with non-24-hour disorder, and you can see them circling around and around the clock. This is a more recent paper showing non-24-hour disorder and showing the period of the sleep-wake cycle, which tends to be between 24 and 24.5 hours in those patients. Now, the last disorder, which I'm not going to spend too much time on, is irregular sleep-wake rhythm disorder. And when we were describing this, we were talking about this mainly in individuals with conditions like Alzheimer's disease and other neurodegenerative disorders such as dementia, where where the individual is sleeping and waking at seemingly random times throughout day and night. Okay, but it turns out that this is happening more and more in people who do not have that kind of neurodegenerative disorder. So when we look at college students, I personally was shocked when we began collecting data on college students carefully over a month to find, and this is the work of an undergraduate for his undergraduate thesis, Will Clark's there, but you can see that while some students maintain a regular schedule, others have a completely erratic schedule and meet all of the criteria of non-24-hour disorder of having 2 to 3 episodes of sleep per day. You can see in this one they're like 4 or 5. This is 24 hours here. No particularly consistent time of sleeping and waking, and yet living at university. We even found, among a group of 60 people we studied, we even found one with non-24-hour disorder completely unaware of the fact that his circadian rhythms were cycling around and around the clock. And that's interesting because we knew from a previous study of someone who had been for 10 years unable to maintain any kind of a job. He graduated from the Boston Latin School as a very gifted individual, but then beyond high school could not go to college, could not have a job, whatever, because his circadian rhythms were oscillating around the clock. We put him on a non-24-hour day length to assess his intrinsic period, and it turned out that he was living on a 25.2-hour average day length, but his circadian period was actually only 24.5 hours. So that meant that he was propelling himself round and round the clock, shifting himself an additional 3/4 of an hour every day with light exposure. So I said to him, great news. We should be able to reset your circadian rhythms with morning exposure to light and help resolve this disability that's kept you out of work for a decade. And he immediately got completely agitated, packed up his things and said, I never said that I wanted to be treated. And he walked out, and that's the last time I saw him. So people can exhibit a symptom like non-24-hour disorder, and I would put him in the same category as the people, and we need to understand more about the pathophysiology about this, but just like some people with delayed sleep-wake phase disorder may not have a delayed circadian phase, an abnormal period may not be driving some of the people with non-24-hour, some of the sighted people with non-24-hour disorder. I'm not talking about the blind people who have non-24-hour disorder because they can't synchronize their circadian, they're missing the light input into the circadian system. Anyway, we found with the irregular sleepers that on average, and look at the range of times that melatonin is onset in this population. One person having melatonin onset at 5 p.m., another person having melatonin onset at 3 a.m., and people all over the map. Even though they're living in the same city, they are 10 hours apart in biological time. Think about that, 10 different time zones representing people living and going to the same school. Those with irregular schedules on average were 3 hours later as compared to those in terms of the onset of melatonin secretion. So that would mean that they would be actually attending class. Let's say they have an 8 a.m. class, that's 5 a.m. biological time. So they're taking their exams at the adverse circadian phase and so on. So it's no wonder that grade point average was highly related to, highly statistically significantly related to irregularity, and the higher their sleep regularity, the more irregular they were, the higher their grade point average, and the more irregular, the lower their grade point average. Turns out that, again, just like in the cases of that case I just showed you of non-24-hour disorder, the regular sleepers had much more light exposure. They had 80% greater total daily light exposure than the irregular sleepers. And besides being more, the irregular sleepers, the centroid of the light exposure was at a much later hour, and we could actually account for 75% of the differences in observed circadian phase just by putting the timing of their light exposure into our mathematical model for that. It explains 75% of the difference in Delmo timing. So, thank you very much for letting me go through all these different, the complexities of the circadian sleep-wake phase disorders for you, and these are the many collaborators who worked on this work and the agencies that have supported it. Thank you for your attention.